Hello, friends, and welcome back to the PrepWell podcast. In this week's episode, I want to discuss AP classes and AP exams. Because the world has changed quite a bit from just a few years ago, and it's important that you know what's happening on the ground today. Don't rely on what your pickleball partner tells you if their child applied to college even 2 or 3 years ago. Some of that information is likely very stale by now. Things have changed dramatically. But before we jump too quickly into some of the subtleties, let's go over some quick background points. Number 1, AP stands for Advanced Placement. Theoretically, these classes are supposed to be for the more academically inclined students, and the classes are supposed to be just as quote-unquote challenging as college-level courses. So by doing well in an AP class, you are, to some degree, demonstrating to colleges that you are already prepared for college-level work, even though you're in high school. Number 2, AP classes typically require more reading, more writing, more problem sets, and generally more work than their non-AP equivalents. So be ready for that. Number 3, some schools offer a lot of AP classes. I'm talking dozens of AP classes. Other schools offer 0 AP classes for one reason or another. And others offer something in between. I believe there's something on the order of 38 official AP courses that are available, and schools get to decide which ones they want to offer. Number 4, I know many students who've taken AP classes online over the summer, for example, either out of the goodness of their hearts, to satisfy a deep intellectual curiosity of theirs about a certain subject, to spike their GPAs, or to differentiate themselves from other students who were sloughing off over the summer. There are many different motivations. Number 5, typically if your high school is on a 4.0 scale, for the purposes of GPA, you would receive a 5.0 instead of a 4.0 for an A in an AP class. That's called being weighted. You get the extra point because of the supposed higher level of work and rigor. Number 6, this is why you see so many students with 4.6, 4.7, 4.8 GPAs, because they've taken a lot of AP classes or other weighted classes, maybe honors classes, and they've gotten A's in those classes. Number 7, AP classes, some people think, are better than so-called honors classes, even though they're often both weighted equally, because of the credibility of the AP classes and the fact that there are official AP exams at the end of the year that are given nationwide and internationally. The fact that a student can prove their knowledge on a particular subject on a widely recognized and credible exam may give colleges more confidence in that student's ability. That is, of course, if they score well on the exam, which we will address at length in this episode. Number 8, AP classes are not new. They've been around for a long, long time. I remember personally taking AP Bio, AP Physics, a few other AP classes back in the day. I'm talking 40 years ago. So this is not a new phenomenon. And finally, yes, there have been cases where students who have performed well in AP classes and on AP exams are able to use these grades to get college credit, sometimes skipping classes when they get to college because they've already, quote unquote, shown competency in certain subjects. In extreme cases, there are rumors that some students have even skipped an entire semester or a year's worth of college thanks to AP credit. Now, this might sound pretty good, especially if you're paying $80,000 a year to go to college, but this is by no means the norm, especially these days. So I would not hold my breath. For one, the students have to prove their proficiency on the AP exams, which normally means getting a 4 or a 5, which, as we'll discuss later in this episode, is not happening very much these days. Second, many colleges don't allow you to skip a class entirely, but instead they allow you to place into a higher level class in the same subject. So for example, if you got a 5 on your AP US History exam in high school, it doesn't necessarily mean that you get out of taking history in your first year of college. It might mean that you could skip to a 200 level history class. And depending on the class and your major, this may not turn out that well. The higher level class is often way beyond the grasp of an incoming freshman. So be careful what you wish for. And each college has different criteria for what they will give credit for or not give credit for. One college might require a 4 on the AP Calc exam, and another college might require a 5. It can get a little bit complicated. The bottom line here is that I would not bank on getting all kinds of college credit or skipping full semesters worth of college because of AP exams. Again, on the edges, it might be helpful. It depends a lot on the college's policy toward AP credit, and certainly look into that. But in my opinion, this should not be a big factor when deciding whether to take AP classes or AP exams or how many to take. It's something that I would look into a couple of weeks before heading off to college when you're selecting your first semester freshman classes. Okay, enough background about AP classes and AP exams. I hope that this gives some of the listeners with younger students a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about. But now I'd like to shift gears and talk about what's happening today. This should be very relevant for any parent with a student in 9th, 10th, 11th, or even 12th grade, whether they are in several AP classes right now or will soon have to decide whether or not to take AP classes and how many. Okay, let's start with the first classic question of how many AP classes should my child take? Of course, like many admissions-related questions, this depends. It depends on how many AP classes are available at their school. It depends on how many AP classes their academic peers typically take each year. It depends on your child's grade. Are they a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior? It depends on how academically motivated they are. It depends on how academically gifted they are. It depends on what else they have going on in their lives in terms of extracurricular activities. It depends on what type of colleges they aspire to attend. It depends on what they're interested in. It depends on who the teacher is for any particular AP class. It depends on whether or not the student is hooked in any other way. And what I mean by hooked is, are they part of the LGBTQ plus community? Are they first-generation students? Are they recruited athletes? Are they a child of a faculty member? Are they from an underrepresented minority? Do they intend to apply early decision somewhere? Do they even have AP classes available to them? These are all important questions to think about and learn as early as 8th and 9th grade. This is another reason to enroll in PrepWell Academy, where I address these issues early on, every week, so that families are prepared to make these critical decisions. Or at a minimum, they know the questions to ask. They know the issues. And if your child is not a typical case, then please schedule a call with me so we can dig into some of those more nuanced issues. I've had 2 sons who took the max number of AP classes available in their high school. They got 5s on all of these AP exams. They both got into Yale and Princeton. I have another son who took very few AP classes, like maybe 2, and took 0 AP exams, and still had offers from Harvard and Stanford and Princeton and the Naval Academy. So as you can see, the student's profile matters. What else are they bringing to the table? There is no one silver bullet solution here. Some students need it, and other students do not. I could spend this whole episode going through different permutations for a few common student profiles, but I don't want to go down this road today. There are just so many different factors that go into the analysis. I don't think it would serve the greater good. Hopefully by the end of this podcast, you will have a good understanding of the issues, and you now know why it's important to start thinking about these things early in 8th and 9th grade. You now have the opportunity to enroll your child in PrepWell Academy's online course, where I bring these issues up at just the right times. And of course, as I said, you can always set up a one-on-one session with me if you want to dig into all of the gory details. Now today, The question has changed from how many AP classes should my child take, which has unfortunately often devolved into as many as humanly possible, to a new question, which is how many AP exams should my child take? Let me repeat that distinction here. The question is no longer how many AP classes should my child take? It's now how many AP exams should my child take? And just so everyone is on the same page here, this question was never an issue before COVID. It was never an issue before the SAT and ACT test became optional. It just wasn't. Back in the day, and I'm talking 2019, students who took an AP class took the AP exam, period. End of story. Was it required? No. Did colleges demand to see the test results? No. Did students take the exams anyway? Yes. There didn't have to be a rule. It was a given. If a student took an AP class, they were expected to take the AP exam at the end of the year to demonstrate how much of the material they understood. AP exams, like the SAT and ACT tests, were taken by students all over the world. They were graded on an objective scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the best. And the scores allowed colleges to see how students compared to one another across different cities and states and territories and countries. And this was very helpful. These types of objective measures allowed colleges to make distinctions among thousands of students who otherwise had very similar academic records. These standardized test scores were the lifeblood of a merit-based admissions process. After all, the number of students with a 4-point-something GPA was rising. There was growing suspicion about grade inflation. Cheating was on the rise as classrooms went digital. And so colleges enjoyed having SAT and ACT scores and AP exam scores to cut through the sea of sameness among students. After all, how else would they know which students were really grasping the material? And then COVID came, and the world changed. Some students had no change in their schooling. They kept going to in-person classes all throughout COVID. And of course, the majority of other students sat on their beds for 2 years, quote-unquote, learning remotely, because their schools were shut down. And for 2 years, we suffered through this chaos and mismanagement and leadership failures. And with this chaos came a sea change in how college admissions offices assessed students. The SAT and ACT became optional. Grades lost even more credibility. After all, some classes, even AP classes, switched to pass-fail. Other schools handed out A's to everybody just because they could, or because they felt bad for the students. And the test optional nature of AP exams, which was always the case, turned into no one needs to take AP exams anymore. And now that we've gotten beyond COVID and things are mostly back to normal, things have not yet snapped back when it comes to taking standardized tests. Students have been seduced into thinking that colleges no longer care about SAT and ACT scores or AP exam scores. This is a myth. It's not true. And I know it sounds great to your average teenager who would rather not study for these exams, but it's not doing them any favors if they want to succeed in an increasingly competitive admissions process. I don't want to get into the discussion about whether or not to take the SAT or the ACT or whether or not to submit your scores to this school or that school. I'm going to leave that for another episode. My quick advice here is to forget that the SAT and ACT tests were ever made optional. Go back to the old-fashioned strategy of studying as hard as you can for the exams, assuming that it's required. And then depending on what you get, we can talk tactics about whether or not to submit them. But please stop wasting precious time and energy trying to find a justification to not take the tests. Just study for one of them and take it. Now let's get back to AP exams. Here's what's happening. There are students all over the country and the world taking AP classes and getting A's. And that's boosting their GPAs. Whoop-de-doo. Unfortunately, many of them, under the delusion that colleges no longer care about AP exam scores, are not paying attention in class, they're not studying for the end-of-year exams, and they're either skipping the exams or failing the exams. And this has become a big problem. Why is it a problem? The exams have always been optional. Why should students care about the exam scores if they're not required by colleges? They should care because without an SAT or an ACT score, and with no AP exam scores, what else do colleges have to assess a student's academic ability? There's almost nothing left. Yes, they can look at the rigor of the classes. Did you take AP or honors classes? Were you in an IB program? They can look at your grades. But grades have very little teeth to them anymore. Colleges can't trust that an A means that a student is doing A-level work. They just can't. Grade inflation is rampant for reasons that I won't dwell on here. So what's left? Well, let me give you an example of how much data colleges used to receive on a student compared to what they receive today in terms of academics. So here's the academic profile from a typical highly competitive student way back in 2019. I know that's hard to think about. That's 3 years ago. Here we go. Listen to these stats. You're an admissions officer. Listen to these academic credentials and make an assessment. GPA, 4.6. Number of AP courses, 6. AP exam scores. Again, the AP exam scores are between 1 and 5. 1 is failing is the worst. 5 is the most. It means you've basically mastered the topic. So this student had AP Bio, 4. AP US History, 5. AP Computer Science, 4. AP Language and Composition, 5. AP Physics, 4. AP World History, 5. Okay, now this student also took 3 SAT subject tests. For those of you who don't even know what an SAT subject is, it was an end-of-year 1-hour test offered by the College Board in about 20 subjects that allowed students to show their ability in a specific subject or subjects of their choice. The scores were out of 800, and many Ivy League schools for years and years and years, quote unquote, highly recommended taking at least 3 or 4 of these tests and getting in the middle 700s on all of them. So let's listen to what this student got on their SAT subject test. SAT subject test for US History, 780, again, out of 800. SAT subject test for Math Level 2, 760. SAT subject test for Literature, 710. Okay, now the next metric is the SAT. The student got a 1530. This is out of 1600. And lastly, the SAT essay score, where this student got a 23 out of 24. Yes, in case you didn't know, many, many years ago, i.e. 3 years ago, the SAT and ACT used to have an essay test as well to show colleges your contemporaneous writing ability, because you had to write it on the spot during the exam. Well, that has been eliminated as well. So after all is said and done, that student has 12 pieces of data, academic data. 11 of the 12 data points are objective measures of academic strength, not subjective measures like grades, which typically have no consistency across schools, cities, states, countries. So now you have a picture in your head of those 12 different metrics of 2019 student. Now we're going to fast forward to a few years to a academic profile of a competitive student in 2022. Okay, here we go. You're an admissions officer. You're reading their academic profile, and it says GPA 4.6, including 6 AP classes. And the rest of the sheet is blank. Why is it blank? Because that's all they're reporting. There's no more data. There are no more academic measures. The student chose not to take or not to submit an SAT or an ACT score. They chose not to take or submit an AP score, even though they took 6 AP classes. There's no longer anything called an SAT subject test. They were done away with a few years ago, so they don't have anything there. And there's no such thing as an SAT essay section, which was done away with a few years ago, so there's no grade there. So you tell me, does a college admissions officer have an easier or a harder time assessing the relative academic strength of the 2019 student or the 2022 student? The 2019 student provided 11 objective measures of their academic ability that colleges could compare with students across the country and the world. The 2022 student provided exactly 0 objective measures of their academic ability. Yes, they showed a strong GPA, but a student's GPA is certainly not an objective measure. It's subjective at best and grossly inflated at worst. So what's an admissions officer to do? Let me put it this way. You aren't helping your case if you present this type of application to a college. Technically, you've done nothing wrong, but boy, have you left your future in question. Boy, have you made the job of the admissions officer much, much harder. Which gets me to the crux of today's episode. Should your child take the AP exam at the end of the year? Well, let's think about what happens if they don't. They technically haven't done anything wrong. The AP exams are still optional. They're self-reported. And they can still take them and not submit them if they so choose. But think about how much doubt they're leaving in the mind of the admissions officer. With all of those AP classes and no final AP exam scores, what's going through the mind of the admissions reader? They're going to wonder whether the A's in those classes were legitimate. After all, if you got an A in the class, that means you've theoretically mastered the material, so why not take the exam to reinforce this notion? Could it be that almost everyone in the class got A's? Or maybe it was because you were lazy and you didn't want to put in the time to study for the AP exam. Or maybe it was because your AP teacher convinced the class that it wasn't important to take the AP exam, and thus the teacher avoids any scrutiny on how good of a teacher they are because nobody took the test. Or maybe it was because you took the AP exams and you failed all of them. And since you aren't obligated to submit your score, maybe you failed them and chose not to submit them. The admissions person has no idea. And if the student also decided not to submit an SAT or an ACT score, is that helping or hurting the student's case? Would this profile present like a highly motivated student trying to put their best foot forward? Or are they a scammer trying to hide behind the new normal? Think about which student and admissions officer would be more willing to advocate for in the selection committee. Would they be more excited to reel off all of the 12 academic metrics from the 2019 pre-COVID student? Or would they be more excited about saying, well, I have a student here who I really like. They have a 4.6 GPA and they took 6 AP classes. And that's about it for academics. They would get laughed out of the committee room. So my point is this. If you're wondering whether or not to study for, to prepare for, and do your best on your AP exams, you better have a rock-solid reason for not doing so. And the reason better not be, oh, it's not required, or I'm too busy to study, or my friend Sandy said I don't have to, or they all seem to be in the same week and I'm not going to have time to study for all of them. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have to beat your head against the wall and stress yourself out trying to get 5s on every AP exam. Maybe you are super busy. Maybe it's more realistic to focus on 3 out of the 5 AP exams, the ones you're super interested in, and leave the others behind. That's fine. I can get behind something like that. I'm not suggesting that you have to be perfect. I am suggesting that you don't get lazy and just throw in the towel and take 0 AP exams, or fail the AP exams because you didn't prepare well enough. This could have major implications on how you do in the admissions process. Even athletes committing to prestigious academic colleges aren't getting into some of the highly competitive programs or majors within the college because they chose not to submit AP exam scores. The admissions office just can't take the chance that they're setting the student up for failure. They just don't have enough evidence that the student deserves to go into these highly competitive programs. Again, it depends on what the rest of your application looks like and where you're applying. If you're applying to a local junior college or a local community college, it's probably not that big a deal if you skip AP exams. However, if you're competing at the increasingly competitive four-year colleges, whether it's private or public, you better bring your A game. And skipping AP exams or failing them because you're lazy, that's not part of the plan. Again, if you want to dig into the details of your child's specific situation, please set up a one-on-one consulting session with me. There are many subtleties and nuances to work out and a lot of factors at play. And if all else fails, fall back on the old, reliable discipline of hard work, dedicated preparation, and starting early. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your continued support. If you know a parent with a 6th, 7th, 8th grader, 9th grader, 10th grader, 11th grader, even a senior in high school that might find this helpful, please share the episode with them. You can do that by finding that small box with a tiny arrow pointing up. That's the share button. Click that button, text your friends the link to this episode with a little personal note from you recommending that they give it a listen. Give us a rating too, if you like what you hear. Apparently that helps the podcast reach a wider audience. If you have questions, comments, or an idea for an upcoming episode, please reach out to me by email, DM me on Instagram, check out our blog, Facebook page, connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you. Until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by PrepWell Academy. PrepWell Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to PrepWellAcademy.com and enroll your child today.